Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar entitled Early Season Weed Control for Improved Weed Resistance Management. I'm Chris Boomsma, Director of Education here at the American Society of Agronomy, and it's my privilege to be today's moderator. All right, well, before we get started, I want to acknowledge our sponsor for today's webinar, Nufarm. We're very, very thankful for their sponsorship. Because of their sponsorship, this webinar is free to you. So thank you very much, Nufarm, and we appreciate your support. A few key notes before we get started. First of all, as always with our webinars, if you do have any issues joining, maybe you have a problem with GoToWebinar, the sound might be giving you issues, anything of the sort, please contact Michelle Lovejoy, my colleague at American Society of Agronomy. You can see her email and phone number on the screen at this time. She'll try to resolve any issues that you may have. Secondly, we will have a question and answer period at the very end of the webinar. I ask that you submit your questions to me using the questions portal on the GoToWebinar panel. I'll take those questions, screen through them, put them in order, consolidate where necessary, and then pose those questions to our speaker at the very end. So again, submit them anytime, and we'll go through them at the end. Next, today's webinar will also include a few comments from Dan Barron, who is the Director of Technical Services at Ag USA, Nufarm, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the agronomy of early season weed control and a little bit about Nufarm's product offerings. So be prepared for that at the end. Also note that this training session is being recorded. It'll be available to participants about 1 week after completion, though we certainly hope and expect to get it up there sooner than that. Last, please watch for future webinars from the American Society of Agronomy in the coming months. We do still have plenty more coming your way. Now, on to today's speaker. Today's speaker is Brian Young, who is a professor of weed science in the Department of Botany and Plant Pathology at Purdue University. He has held an academic appointment with teaching, research, and outreach activity for over 20 years. His research and education work at Purdue University focuses on evaluating herbicide application technologies and characterizing weed herbicide resistance. His goal is to bridge the basic and applied aspects of weed management research to improve weed management recommendations for crop producers and land managers. He earned a bachelor's in crop and soil sciences at Michigan State and a PhD in crop science from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So, Brian, we are thankful you're here today, and we do certainly appreciate your time. And with that, I'm going to turn over presentation privileges to you. And when you're ready, we look forward to seeing your slides and hearing from you about early season weed control. Thanks a lot, Brian.
Well, thank you, Chris, and good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today and talk about early season weed management. Obviously, over the last several decades, we've had some major challenges with herbicide resistance, and that's the reason for this discussion today, is to talk about how do we approach that. And today we've broken it down into the early season weed management component, because there are some things that we need to be doing there that set the tone for the rest of the growing season. And so I'm going to be talking about those with corn and soybeans and maybe cotton in mind to some extent, but primarily the focus will be on soybean, since that seems to be where the major challenge is in many areas, as well as cotton. So as I go through this presentation, I'm going to refer to a lot of materials from the Take Action initiative, which is a combined effort from a lot of land-grant universities, crop protection specialists, not just weed science, but also entomologists and plant pathologists. So land-grant universities, commodity groups such as United Soybean Board, with this Take Action initiative originated with in terms of weed management, as well as private industry, those herbicide manufacturers. So as a point of having references for you to have later on after this discussion, I'd refer you to that website, iwilltakeaction.com/weeds, for some of this information that I'll discuss. And the materials that I'll show will have the Take Action logo, so you know which ones you might be able to find on that website, because it's very difficult through a webinar to make sure you have a takeaway of some sort. So I want to make sure that you have these materials for future reference. So I'm going to start out by looking at kind of the most wanted, if you will, in terms of weeds. These are the weeds that have shown a lot of resistance to herbicides, and there's 11 that you can see in front of you. And it includes water hemp, Palmer amaranth, mare's tail. Those are the weeds that I'm going to focus on quite a bit today. But you'll also notice the different colored boxes or squares with numbers in there, and that would refer to the herbicide site of action group. Now, on the lower portion of this particular material, you can find that we have the different herbicide site of action groups listed. So for instance, we have group 1 and group 2, which contain several different herbicide active ingredients. Same thing for the group 4 herbicides, synthetic auxins like dicamba and 2,4-D. But there's other groups that are pretty simple, like group 9 and group 10, where we have glyphosate is the only herbicide molecule in group 9, and Liberty is only herbicide in group 10. But I'm going to be referring to these different herbicide site of action groups and how we can use those to combat some of the resistance that we have today. Because when we talk about the weed species, we are going to be talking about what are these weeds resistant to that causes them to be so problematic. And as you can see, all these species on here have a host of resistance mechanisms involved to various herbicide site of action groups. And right now, barnyard grass is leading the pack with all those different squares involved, where they have nine different herbicide sites of action that barnyard grass is resistant to. So this is where the problem comes in. All these weed species were much more easier to manage, and we didn't talk about these as much before we had this multiple resistance. But now that it is the problem today facing us, this multiple resistance, that's where management takes a different approach, different mindset. And this graph really just documents over time the progression of multiple resistance in a single species. So you can see we have some that go all the way up to 5-way or 6-way resistance, common water hemp, Palmer amaranth, where we continue to have new herbicide sites of action documented that we have resistance in these species. And so that's not just in a field. You have an individual weed that's resistant to herbicide A and another weed resistant to herbicide B. It's where we have the stacked resistance, if you will, multiple resistance, where a single plant can withstand 6 different herbicide site of action groups. And that's really the game changer and why we're talking about this today, because we used to be able to just open up the new jug, a new herbicide mode of action. That's how we fixed resistance, by opening up something new from industry that could solve the problem. Well, the fact is that the last herbicide site of action commercialized for use in corn or soybeans was 20 years ago. And that chemistry was really developed or discovered 10 years prior to that. So we're looking at a 30-year drought for new herbicide modes of action being brought to market. And that has allowed us to rely on older herbicides to manage these problems, and also culminate into having multiple resistance in the weeds that we're trying to fight today. So we're going to have situations such as this, where we have 3 driver weeds, water hemp, horseweed, Palmer amaranth. And when I say driver weeds, when I do meetings and talk with growers or retailers, this is the primary discussion they want to have, is control of individual weed species with multiple resistance. So very infrequently do I get invited to a meeting or ask questions about weeds other than these 3. Because they're driving our herbicide programs, driving our weed control tactics, and right now, frankly, they're driving our crop seed selection, because the herbicide resistance traits we want in our crop to help combat these weeds long term. So it's one thing to have Palmer amaranth in your field or have horseweed with multiple resistance in your field, but as you can see, this one grower has all 3 weed species in their field from Southern Illinois. So that escalates the problem, more than you can imagine in terms of trying to regain control of field populations such as this. So on that Take Action website, there is a document entitled Best Management Practices for Herbicide Resistance. It goes through these 12 different steps, which you should think or consider at least when developing your herbicide resistance program. The first one that I'm going to start with, though, is understanding the biology of the weeds that are present. And you might say, well, I know, I've had water hemp for years, I've had horseweed for years, but just having it is one thing, but we really need to think about, when is it being a problem? When is it escaping our management? What tactics has it shown an ability to escape? So the first thing I start with in terms of knowing the biology is, when are these weed species a problem? So this is a fairly crude table that I developed based on my experience as well as research, looking at the emergence patterns of these primary weed species. And in orange, I have the primary weed emergence patterns that we might see. So this is when it comes up most often. And in yellow, you might have a flush of this particular species come up in that month or in that time frame as well, but not as much as area denoted by the orange. So if you see for horseweed, it's going to come up fall, spring, all the way through May is when we would consider it to be peak emergence pattern. But we can still get additional flushes in June, July, August, and then it goes right back in there to the fall. So some have said that we will have mare's tail emergence or horseweed emergence anytime the ground isn't frozen, and I do believe that from my experience in Illinois and in Indiana. Now for water hemp, Palmer amaranth, well, that's where we really need the soil to warm up a little bit more for those species to feel comfortable in terms of germination and emergence. Water hemp is a little bit more cold tolerant for emergence than Palmer amaranth. So beginning in April, we can start to see water hemp emergence, depends on your geography, but really it's May and June when you see peak emergence for both of these species. Palmer amaranth continues to germinate even through the hotter months of July, but you can see by yellow that if we don't have canopy closure, we continue to have germination events of both these amaranthus species through the end of August or even after that. But focusing in on this presentation today, I want to talk about early season weed management. So I'm going to be talking primarily anywhere from fall through the end of May, with the mindset that May gets us through to that post-emergence application we have in crop. And so I'm going to talk about everything that goes from pre-plant application to getting up to that post application. And that's what I have highlighted in green here. So if we look at these emergence patterns, horseweed is something that we could be doing last fall or start to do early this spring. So now we know a little bit more about the biology in terms of emergence, I want to highlight some of the best management practices we have for cultural, mechanical, and chemical control measures. So something that's talked about, but I would say rarely observed or practiced by growers, can be prevent introduction of new weeds. Now this sounds pretty simple, but if we did that over the last 10 years, we wouldn't have Palmer amaranth hardly in the Midwest, but we didn't prevent introduction of new weed species. In many cases, we misidentified it and thought it was just another pigweed species, maybe it was redroot pigweed or smooth pigweed, and we didn't think anything of it and let it go to seed, and now we have the problem that that exists today in some areas. Crop rotational diversity, some would argue that we don't have a lot of flexibility in rotating our crops. It's corn and soybeans followed by corn and soybeans, or maybe in the Mid-South, some rice and cotton as well. So maybe we have limited opportunity to increase our crop rotation diversity. But another thing that we do have opportunity to do is alter our row spacing. There's a lot of soybeans grown in 30-inch rows, and maybe there's been some considerations about narrowing that row spacing up for various benefits. One might be weed management, and I can tell you our experience has been through research that narrowing your row spacing from 30 inches down to 15 inches or drilled can make an end of season difference by about 10% weed control for water hemp, as one example. Now increasing your crop seeding rate, let's say going from 140,000 seeds per acre to 180 or 220,000 seeds, well, that's a fairly modest improvement in weed management because of quicker canopy closure. Our best ability to close that canopy fastest is by altering the row spacing, not through seeding rate. So if I had to take one of these two tactics, it'd be changing the row spacing, which I know is more difficult than just increasing that seeding rate. Another thing is increasing cover crops, which I will talk about, and some have discussed or some have implemented obviously commercially for several years now. And then mechanical methods, use tillage where appropriate. I know we have some diehard no-tillers, and I haven't converted a no-tiller into tilling their field just for weed management purposes yet. I think there's other tools that we can use. So we'll talk about tillage a little bit. Harvest weed seed control, that's something that's a little bit new. But you can take it similar to having somebody go out in the field just prior to harvest and pulling out those weeds that have produced some seed and getting rid of that plant so the seed doesn't go down to the soil. Well, there are some mechanical measures that we can do and have been tested under early development right now. That would involve attachment of kind of like a hammer mill to the back of your combine. It collects all the chaff, all the weed seeds that might be going through there, especially for something like soybean harvest where all the weeds are going through there. Gets ground up. And we have had some success, but that might be something for the future where we can manage those weed seeds a little bit better and kill them as they go through the combine instead of just spraying them across the field. Hand weeding, which we talk about, but nobody likes to do, and so I'll just move on from there. And then chemical. Chemical is the easiest thing that we can do, but it also can be one of the more expensive areas that we manage herbicide resistance with. And one thing I will say is that managing herbicide resistance just with herbicides is not a long-term sustainable measure. It can be a short-term measure, but in terms of being a long-term measure, we have proven over the last 60 years that herbicides by itself is not sustainable as well, and will always be developing weed resistance and be on this resistance treadmill, if you will. But there are things that we can do within herbicides to help management, such as not using a single herbicide at a time, so tank mixtures and foliar applications. Using soil residual herbicides would be the preferred, and I'll explain that a little bit later. And then one thing I want to mention is, using full rates or using high enough rates to get the effect that you need. Sometimes we're tempted to cut our herbicide bill and reduce the herbicide rates, or we're concerned about potential for crop response. And really what goes out the window with that is, how much residual weed control we actually see from that. And I'm going to show you some data a little bit later that highlights the importance of using the right rate. I like to say that my goal in weed management is that I get 90% control of my residual herbicides, so that my post-emergence herbicides only have to control 10% of my weed population. I know that might be a lofty goal, but it's something that we can accomplish, and I think when we do that, we are reducing selection for herbicide resistance. So let's go back to the weed emergence graph. And if we look at the emergence patterns, we're using cover crops in some areas. So if you think about it, if cover crops are going to have an impact, probably the one weed species on this list that have the greatest impact for management would be horseweed. And in fact, that's correct according to some research that's been done. Here's some from University of Missouri, and it demonstrates the same herbicide program, glyphosate plus fierce, applied 4 weeks prior to planting on glyphosate-resistant mare's tail. Okay, so it's glyphosate resistant, but in black, you see no cover crop. In yellow, you see the herbicide treatment with the cover crop. And this is the level of weed control for mare's tail at planting. And you see a pretty stark difference of about 65%, 60%, where we had near complete control of mare's tail by using a cover crop in combination with a herbicide. And I think that's important to state that cover crops have not replaced the need for herbicides, but they're a good complement for herbicides. And cereal rye is one of the most effective cover crop species we have for weed suppression. And mare's tail is one of the easiest ones that we can manage because it's a winter annual, and that's when the cover crop is growing. We have less effectiveness by using cereal rye for control of summer annual species such as Palmer amaranth or water hemp. Now they can have some good suppression, but not near as well as we can with mare's tail, where you can see we're getting up to 95% control. Some more research out of the University of Missouri shows that cereal rye can help suppress weed biomass by 70%, as well as some of these other cover crops, vetch combination, as well as wheat. And I think that's important to remember because, yes, you can suppress weeds by using an effective cover crop. But one thing I want to point out is that a fall herbicide was also very effective, more effective than the cover crops themselves at reducing weed biomass. So the question would be, well, then why are we bothering with cover crops? Why don't we just use fall herbicides? Well, frankly, fall herbicides don't make sense in highly erodible soils or where soil conservation is going to be a concern. And we're using cover crops for other reasons than just weed suppression. There's the soil health benefit that you might also get for some cover crop species included in the rotation. But I just put this slide up here so that you can think about herbicides are effective. So more consistent, more effective than what cover crops are. And that's where cover crops can help supplement herbicides. But again, I've not been able in my research to replace a herbicide by using a cover crop. They're just a supplement. So let me get to something that was utilized quite a bit when glyphosate-resistant mare's tail was first identified in many areas. People bought big discs and they abandoned no-till and thought they were going to just till their way out of herbicide resistance problem. And for an issue such as mare's tail, that did help initially for establishing early season weed control. But in areas that had heavy infestations, they did find that if you had a lot of seed production from mare's tail in previous years of failure, even when you tilled the soil, you had enough mare's tail that would come to the surface and germinate. Even after crop planting was pretty annoying, I'm sure. But the type of tillage is important. Are we talking about conventional tillage where we get out the mower plow? Or are we talking about pre-plant tillage? Just something to get the crop started, and after that there's no more tillage? Or is it an in-season weed control method such as row cultivation? The row cultivation is pretty rare. But obviously that's the one that would have the greatest impact on our summer annual weed species such as water hemp and Palmer amaranth. Instead, we're using more of the pre-plant tillage, which can be effective for management of mare's tail horseweed and have some effect on any emerged Palmer amaranth and water hemp. But after that, essentially we're using just herbicides in many cases and not using tillage for control of Palmer amaranth and water hemp. Another comment I'd like to make relates to this field. So on the right-hand side of the picture is a field infested with glyphosate-resistant mare's tail. There's so much mare's tail there, the grower decided not to bother with herbicides, and they used the field cultivator twice on the right-hand side of the picture. On the left-hand side, because it included the headland, they actually tilled that 3 times. And even with cultivation 3 times, they're still not going to have complete control of some of those mare's tail plants. So cultivation is not going to be effective at controlling large plants. Maybe if they're smaller, that'd be effective, but not after they bolted and were already 6 to 12 inches in height. This field requires a disc, not a fast finish turbo till or anything like that. It's going to require a disc to manage mare's tail that height or several tillage passes of something like a cultivation. And this is probably one of the #1 reasons that I get complaints or hear about complaints for mare's tail is the grower thought that they utilized effective tillage method. In many cases, I will pick on vertical tillage. They used vertical tillage while mare's tail was up. They tried to warm up the seed bed and use vertical tillage to get the field planted. They noticed that, that vertical tillage did not control those mare's tail plants. It just buried them temporarily or injured them somewhat, but they eventually grew out of it and they were caught without having an effective burn down or residual herbicide on that field. And so they essentially just injured their mare's tail, but the weeds kept on coming after that. So I'm going to move into the most widely used areas, the chemical or herbicide management for control of some of these early season weed problems that we have. And so I'm going to start with horseweed or mare's tail, just go in chronological order of the growing season. So in terms of corn, that's pretty easy. There are several effective herbicide site of action groups that we have available in corn. The bleaching herbicides, atrazine, the auxin growth regulator herbicides. So several. And so the main challenge has been in soybean production. That's why that's going to be the focus of a lot of my presentation today is on the soybean side. So in soybean, we historically have a problem not starting clean, and then we don't keep it clean. And then unfortunately what happens is when we don't manage mare's tail, we get sidetracked later in the season and probably don't end up managing our water hemp or Palmer amaranth as well as we could either, because we have to utilize other herbicides for mare's tail that are going to be different than what we need for Palmer amaranth and water hemp. So we need to start clean, get rid of the mare's tail so that we can then focus on some of our other weed species. So in terms of control, in the rosette stage would be ideal. Typically when those are smaller than 3 inches, that might be in the fall, could be in the early to mid-spring. And when they get larger than 3 inches, we tend to have a lot of regrowth from the inner whorl of that horseweed plant. And so that's why 3 inches for rosette for me is key, because anything bigger than that, you tend to reduce herbicide efficacy, activity, and you might have survival. Now it might seem odd that when I talk about bolting plants, we might be targeting weeds that are less than 4 inches. So it's like, well, why can they be 4 inches tall, but I don't want 4-inch rosette? It's because once they start to have upward growth, they've bolted, they don't have the same potential to regrow from that inner whorl because they don't have that growth habit anymore. Once they're 4 inches tall, they have they're growing up, and you need to control that plant, but it's kind of different behavior than when it's growing in the rosette stage. But for all of our herbicides that we have available today, I know some might be able to control an 8-inch tall plant, maybe 12-inch tall plant, but from a good practice standpoint, consistency, we need to be managing those when they're really in that 2 to 4-inch range, or even smaller if possible. Residual herbicides are necessary in areas that have a long history of horseweed or mare's tail, because we do get germination throughout the growing season and need to maintain that control. In conventional or Roundup Ready soybeans, we don't have a lot of post herbicide options after planting if we have mare's tail that is glyphosate and ALS resistant. And you can see by the little icon I have up in the top right that mare's tail has resistance to 5 different herbicide groups. Now, fortunately, group 22, which is paraquat, as well as group 5 and 7, which are the triazines, we don't have a lot of resistance in terms of number of acres infested. What we do have resistance to is glyphosate group 9 and group 2, the ALS inhibiting herbicides. And that's why I put down here that if you have ALS and glyphosate resistant mare's tail, once your soybeans are up, you have very limited options if you're in a traditional Roundup Ready 2 soybean production system, or even conventional. So we'd be very mindful of that. Now, if you're in Liberty Link or Extend soybeans, you do have obviously the opportunity to apply glufosinate or Liberty type product, post-emergence, or dicamba. One thing I want to remind you though is if you try to utilize those in a burn down prior to planting, both Liberty and dicamba don't work very well on mare's tail or horseweed under cool conditions. And I'm sure a lot of you have some experience that Roundup and 2,4-D combinations in a burn down under a cold front that came through. It's very slow activity, or in some cases it does indeed fail, and you need to address that failed weed management with a later application. So just be mindful that both dicamba and Liberty are going to work better on mare's tail under warmer conditions. When I mean warmer, I mean over 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's something to just be mindful that those can be used in burn down systems, but they cannot be relied on as the only herbicide in that burn down. This is also available for a download on that Take Action website. It talks about how to approach horseweed management, primarily in soybean, because that's was funding a lot of the Research United Soybean Board for this extension activity. You might notice that it says Liberty Link soybeans, the most effective strategy. That's because this came out before Extend soybeans. So obviously right now we would have access to Extend and the use of dicamba soybeans as well as Liberty Link. So those would both be equivalent strategies in my opinion right now if you're faced with mare's tail that's glyphosate and ALS resistant. So when it comes to mare's tail management, there's 2 strategies. On the left you can see it's a fall burn down followed by a spring application. That fall application might include auxin herbicides. There's 3 to choose from right now with the recent introduction of haloxifin, but also metribuzin, saflufenicil, which is sharpen, and then paraquat or gramoxone. So those are all available, as well as glyphosate for maybe management of some other weed species in that fall burn down. And then you follow that up in the spring with any of those herbicides if you have emerged mare's tail. So any of those 4 different herbicide site of action groups listed above, but also you can add to that another group 2 herbicide, chloranthalam, and then flumioxazin. So these are important herbicide options that can be used. And another one that can be used is chloromuron that I just forgot to mention on this slide. But chloromuron is group 2, similar to chloranthalum. Flumioxazin is another one. Now, strategy number 2 is a split spring. So I've had some individuals say that we had a bad fall, we had a late harvest, it was too wet, I couldn't get my fall applied herbicide accomplished. Most of the fall herbicide programs that would be designed for soybean weed management can be used as an early spring application as well. So if you bought the herbicide or you've been waiting to apply it, there's still opportunity to apply it early this spring. And then you can follow that back up closer to planting with some of these other herbicides similar to strategy 1. And again, I failed to include chloromuron as a key component in this, but certainly could be used in either the fall or in that spring application timing. Now, does it take 2 applications? Nobody wants to do 2 applications. I remember retailers 12 years ago and growers tell me, I do not want to do 2 applications. Turns out that they are doing 2 applications out of necessity, because what happens when we rely on a single spring application, it's our highest risk of failure, because in some cases we want to make sure that we extend that residual. So we have a residual herbicide in our burn down for water hemp or Palmer amaranth, and we delay that burn down until the horseweed gets too large of a size, and it's just difficult managed to burn down that tall of a weed species. In other cases, you might be tempted to put that out, let's say early April, when the mare's tail is relatively small. But if you're using a residual herbicide with that, sometimes we lack that residual in that late May and June timeframe because it's been out there too long under too high rainfall amounts. So a single spring application can be effective, but it's the highest risk factor that we have compared to a 2-pass program, fall and spring or split spring. So this is what happens when you rely on a single technology. Yes, 2,4-D has activity on mare's tail, and so does Clarity. And I know this is 8 ounces of Clarity. We might be using in the burn down system twice that rate in the form of Ingenia or Extendamax or some other dicamba formulations these days. But what I'm trying to show here is even after application, we don't get complete control if used by itself. And part of that has to do with the cooler conditions under which we're trying to burn down mare's tail. And these herbicides by themselves aren't going to work very effectively. So this slide might take a little bit to be absorbed, but this has to do with horseweed. And you see the emergence pattern. That's the orange where I'm trying to manage with some of these herbicides. And on the left-hand column, I'm just highlighting the herbicide site of action groups, which can be utilized in mare's tail weed management. You can see that glyphosate can be a component, sure, but if it's glyphosate resistant, might have to rely on some auxin herbicides, ALS inhibiting herbicides, the PPO inhibiting herbicides, and then metribuzin and paraquat. Now you might notice that for auxins, after we get into April, I'm a little bit hesitant to throw dicamba haloxavin in there, because they're going to have restrictions in terms of, well, for haloxavin, a 14-day pre-plant restriction before planting soybean. Dicamba, it depends if you're in extend soybeans or non-extend soybeans. If you're going to have to have a certain amount of rainfall that occurs, and then wait so many days after that for planting, and then 2,4-D at a pint, then it's just a 7-day waiting period. So the auxins, it really depends on what soybean technology you're planting and rainfall and number of days necessary to observe as a pre-plant interval. The other thing I'll mention that is I'm not including flumioxazin until in April, because I see the better value, because it has some activity on Amaranthus species, to utilize it closer to that planting time, so you can see the benefit not just for mare's tail, but also for water hemp or Palmer amaranth. So now we're going to move on to managing some of the pigweed species, and namely water hemp and Palmer amaranth. So the first thing would be scout weeds, to make sure you know what species you're trying to manage. I still have a lot of individuals in the Midwest tell me that they thought they had redroot pigweed or water hemp, but it turns out it was Palmer amaranth, and it got ahead of them before they actually identified what it was. So I just want to highlight that as a needed management tactic to scout your fields and know what you're managing. But then we also have to be aggressive at management. Assume water hemp and Palmer amaranth are both ALS and glyphosate resistant. As you can see, there's 6, now 7, if you include what University of Illinois recently reported for group 15 resistance. But there's lots of stacked resistance in water hemp. The biggest ones we have to manage, though, would be glyphosate resistance, group 9, and group 2, the ALS resistance. Yes, there's been a lot of increase in group 14 resistance. That'd be PPO resistant water hemp. There's been a huge increase, but the main thing I want to say there is we have soil residual herbicides that are PPO inhibiting herbicides such as sulfentrazone and flumioxazine, which still remain effective. So that's why I'm focused on ALS and glyphosate resistant, even though you might have some PPO resistance, but in terms of soil residual herbicides, that's not going to influence my herbicide choice. We do need to focus on residual herbicides, utilize cultural practices such as row spacing or maybe cover crops to help supplement weed management, and then think about how much seed are we going to allow to spread in our fields? Are we going to run it through the combine? Hopefully we don't do that and can manage these weed species through better seed management as well. Similar to mare's tail, there's a handout or fact sheet on Palmer amaranth and water hemp on the website. I'm just showing the water hemp fact sheet on this particular slide, but both are available, and they talk about the value for residual herbicides and overlapping residuals in that early post-application window, which is, I can't say critical enough. It is the only way that we're going to manage some of these species in a more sustainable fashion. We have to stop relying so much on our post-emergence herbicides in whether it be Liberty Link or Enlist soybeans in the future, or maybe in Extend soybeans. We can't rely on that post-emergence chemistry as a long-term solution. Now this is looking at some data, and I'm sure many of you have experience with residual herbicides. This is highlighting the variable levels of activity you can get with a residual herbicide. We did some research in 2011 and 12 across a couple different sites in the state of Illinois, and this is averaged across several different residual herbicides and rates, but they're applied at different application timings. So we applied these residual herbicides 28 days before planting, 14 days ahead of planting, and right at planting. And you can see the length of water hemp control that we observed by the brown bars for 3 weeks after planting, and then 6 weeks after planting with the black. One thing I want to highlight is my goal is I want at least 90% or greater control by 3 weeks after planting with my residual herbicide. That's my target. Because again, I don't want my post-emergence herbicide to have to control more than 10% of my weed population when it comes to Palmer amaranth or water hemp. And you can see in that situation, the only herbicide that was able to achieve that was when we applied that herbicide close to planting. Earlier application timings in the spring, we had rainfall on these herbicides. They just didn't last long enough to reach that level of control 3 weeks after planting. Now, keep this in mind that the 14-day early pre-plant application and at planting, there's only 2 weeks difference in terms of when they were applied. But when we look at weed control, the 3 weeks after planting, that got us to roughly May 21st. The 6 weeks after planting, that got us to June 15th. And you can see that by applying the residual herbicides at planting, we had 90% control through June 15th, whereas we didn't even achieve that for 3 weeks after planting when we applied it 2 weeks prior to planting. Okay, and I think that's very critical because this demonstrates it's not exactly which herbicide you choose for residual water hemp control or Palmer amaranth, it's how you use that herbicide that's critical. And here's just some pictures that demonstrate that. 28 days ahead of planting, top left, top right is 14 days, and then applied at planting with this picture taken at planting. So which one of those are you being better stewards of your post-emergence herbicide by not exposing it to a lot of weeds where you might have selection for herbicide resistance? I think pretty easily we can see it's that bottom picture that shows that. In terms of the residual herbicide rate, that's something that we often think about with low commodity prices. I need to cut something out of my input costs. I need to get something out. And so some will look at herbicide rate. And so I have on the left reduced rate of residual herbicides, and on the right, the full rate. And again, evaluated at 3 weeks versus 6 weeks after planting with the brown and black bars. And so to achieve my target of getting at least 90% control 3 weeks after planting, the only way we're going to get close to that is by using the full rate. We never did approach that with a reduced rate. So how does this look in the field? The low rate on the left, this particular herbicide contains sulfentrazone and chloramuron applied 14 days prior to planting. So low rate on the left. About the time that we had V1 transitioning to V2 growth stage of soybeans, we had water hemp that was up to 6 inches tall. So that would be beyond our comfortable post-emergence application timing. Okay, so we would have had to apply our residual herbicide essentially at V1 or earlier for that post-herbicide to have a good chance of controlling all those weeds. And there's a lot of them. Whereas with the high rate, there's fewer weeds, they're smaller. Right now, they're at the 1 to 3 inch stage, and this would be more ideal for a post-emergence application where you can also utilize an overlapping residual in that application as well. So if we look at the same table that I showed before, except focusing on water hemp now and the different herbicide site of action groups on the left, you can see the group 15 herbicides like metolachlors and ziduas or peroxysulfones. They're included for early season weed management as well as overlapping post-emergence applications if necessary. And then we have the group 14 herbicides, Authority and Valor type products certainly would be in that category as well as some of the Panther products. And then we have metribuzin, pendimethalin, paraquat can be parts of this system. But again, it's overlapping residuals of the group 15 herbicides, which gives us an advantage that we really need to focus on moving forward. But when you have group 2, ALS resistant and glyphosate resistance, here's the modes of action that we're focused on. Group 15, group 14, and in some cases group 5. That's really what we're focused on for these amaranthus species. And this table is from a Purdue publication highlighting management of Palmer amaranth and soybean, and just highlights the herbicide site of action groups, the different trade names, and the active ingredients and sites of action that might be involved for getting residual control of this particular weed species. And if I were just to highlight what's the take home there, it's still sulfentrazone and flumioxazin active ingredients in these products that are doing the majority of the work that we need to focus on for residual control. And I'm going back to some data that's getting, well, it's over 20 years old. But from 99 to 2003, I averaged across 15 trials that I conducted in Southern Illinois on weeds that were still sensitive to glyphosate. And I think that's an important aspect. So we had 1 pass of glyphosate, 2 pass of glyphosate on weeds that glyphosate was controlling. Okay. We looked at yield. We got 81 and 92% of our yield went from 1 pass to 2 pass system. And the red line indicates the variability or risk associated with that yield. So when you controlled weeds, 2 passes made the most sense. Now my concern is we're doing that with dicamba today in Extend systems, or we're doing that with Liberty today in the Liberty Link system. Comparing that to a soil residual herbicide, you can see that we can achieve similar yields. In some cases, if you look at the red line, maybe you can do a little bit better. But when it comes to resistance management, we have a lot more confidence moving on to a residual herbicide followed by a single post. And in today's world, maybe even a post with overlapping residual to achieve the yield that we want, protect our yield, and be better at managing resistance as well. So again, herbicide site of action groups that are critical for us today would include several. But if we're looking at the burn down system, ALS inhibitors are still key, auxin herbicides, triazine herbicides or photosynthetic inhibitors, glyphosate, PPO inhibitors, and then gramoxone or paraquat. Where do we get residual weed control from? ALS inhibitors, although we do have some resistance, they still have value in other weed species, and in most cases they'll have better activity from a soil residual than a post application. Still, it's photosynthetic inhibitors such as metribuzin, and then the group 14 and 15 herbicides as well that we're targeting for that residual control. So just to summarize what I presented in the last 40 minutes or so, We need to integrate non-chemical weed control methods where possible. So we talked about soybean row spacing or crop row spacing in general, cover crops. Maybe there's tillage opportunities for some that might be involved as well. We can't rely just on herbicides in the distant future for all of our weed control needs. Start early. Again, it seems like we have the greatest challenges when we're trying to play catch up with the weeds, and we just don't have the chemistry to do that very effectively long term. So we need to start clean and then keep it clean using residuals. Then we have to use the optimal application timing. Does that herbicide work better close to planting? Is it better as a residual herbicide than it is a post-emergence herbicide? Because the return on investment for your herbicide dollar spent is not which herbicide you choose as much as how you use that herbicide. So you determine how much return that herbicide will have. It's not necessarily just the herbicide cost that you pay at the retailer. Another thing with residual herbicides, they tend to have fewer restrictions than some of the post-herbicide options we have today. And so I guess I'll just pick on dicamba and trying to make a legal application. Yes, it can be done. It can control weeds, but there's a lot of rules and regulations that dictate whether you can make an application of dicamba today that doesn't pertain to these soil residual herbicides. There are several different herbicide site of action groups that can be effective in the burn down for mare's tail, as well as the host of other winter annual weed species that we might have. And when it comes to the residual control of these problematic weed species, the group 2 herbicides can be effective on several different weed species still. The ALS inhibitors, we don't need to throw those away. They still have some utility. Metribuzin has been making a comeback in terms of its residual activity. Group 14 herbicides, again, we're focused on flumioxazin and sulfentrazone, Authority and Valor type products, which have a lot of utility for Palmer amaranth and water hemp control. And then the group 15 herbicides, because they can be used prior to planting as well as that overlapping post-emergence around that 3 weeks after planting timing. So a lot of different tools that we can use, we just need to use them appropriately. So again, bringing this to a close, we need to understand the weeds that are a problem, how they're escaping our management, what weeds we have in the field, the different herbicide tools we have available, the different modes of action, how we combine them to combat the herbicide resistance in our field. Make sure we use the herbicide wisely by how we spray it, not just in terms of what nozzles and coverage we have, but when you spray it, the timing of it, whether it's on small weeds or in reference to a residual herbicide and how soon before planting that residual herbicide gets used. And then we also have making weed management affordable. You need to be profitable. And I believe we have ways to control these weeds that we can be profitable and satisfy everything previously that I mentioned on this slide. So with that, I think we need to really get a different mindset. And this one, I will. And so it's really dedicating ourselves. I will take a different approach to weed management. And I know one grower who says that every time he harvests his fields and he sees weeds out in his field, he tries to think of one thing he can do for next year's harvest that's going to improve his weed management. So I thank you for your time. That's the presentation I have. I know we'll be taking questions a little bit later, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, Brian, thank you very much. We're going to switch gears a little bit here real quick. We're going to head on over to Dan Barron from Nufarm. And so just one moment, please, while we switch on over. Dan, you there with us?
Yes, I am. Thanks,
All
everybody.
right.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate Brian's comments and perspective. It's really great to get a refresher and the latest on some of the challenges that we're facing when it comes to early season weed management. Again, quick introduction of myself, Dan Barron, Director of Tech Services with Nufarm. I just wanted to share a couple of things to reinforce and kind of give you our perspective around our resistance weed management and a couple of solutions that our portfolio brings to the table when managing early season weeds, particularly on some of the drivers that Dr. Young was talking about. So if we could get to the next slide there. Yeah, just a little bit about Nufarm. Folks, I recently joined Nufarm as Director of Tech Service here in 2019. You can see a couple of things about Nufarm. We are a top 5 crop protection supplier, very basic in phenoxies, the 2,4-Ds, MCPAs, those types of things, as well as in glyphosate and dicamba. And so as we think of some of our key products and active ingredients that that were basic. And, the idea of stewarding and managing these chemistries is really near and dear to us and critical to growers as well. So a little bit about us there. We do formulate our products in the U.S. We have production in Illinois, as well as coming online down in Mississippi. And any comments that I've got here today, if you want to follow up, here's our website. We're at nufarm.com, and you can also track some of the things we're doing on Twitter as well. Next slide there, Chris, as we move on, just some of the things that I look at from the guiding principle of weed resistance management that Dr. Young hit on really line up with how we're trying to develop our portfolio and bring some products and active ingredients to the marketplace, really with some of the guiding principles, obviously deploying multiple effective modes of action, just as we discussed here this morning, knowing that they need to be used at effective rates and also paired with the right application technology, be it adjuvants and spray volumes and things like that do make sure that we're maximizing the value of the products we're using. Layering residual herbicides and timing them correctly is certainly something that we also consider as we start to look at our portfolio of products. And then particularly in no-till systems, when we're battling weeds like mare's tail or horseweed, utilizing those windows that we have available with fall and some of the pre-plant burn downs are really critical, especially when it does come to managing things like fall germinating mare's tail. And then as we hit on here this morning, there's a lot of cultural practices that we look at as well when we're developing and doing research around our products. Next slide. Yeah, so just wanted to highlight, folks, here today a couple of product solutions really that I think align with some of these principles that we're looking at. And one would be Spitfire. It's a unique formulation of 2,4-D ester and dicamba acid. So a couple of things about that when it does come to formulation types. As we heard this morning, if you're putting out a group 4 herbicide in early spring, you've got some challenges. And so having an ester formulation of 2,4-D is certainly going to perform better than an amine when it comes to activity in cool conditions. And also having that formulation of an ester and dicamba acid also makes for better mixing with the various forms of glyphosate formulations, particularly potassium salts are going to mix better with that sort of formulation. And so it's really designed for, number one, activity in early spring, and then also a formulation that's going to play well with some of the tank mix partners that are necessary to have a good early season burn down. So one of the things about Spitfire and talking with folks here really in a lot of no-till country here this last fall is that we feel like a lot of areas got squeezed on their fall applications. So we know the pre-plant burn down time is going to be a crunch in a lot of geographies. So one of the things about Spitfire, it's got a 7-day pre-plant interval. If you've got a half-inch of rainfall, you'd be at a 7-day pre-plant ahead of soybeans. So knowing that you could get some 2,4-D ester as well as the dicamba incorporated for some of those applications would really be critical, again, as we're looking at mare's tail or horseweed control as well. And then a second product that I just highlight here, and again, this is one that was developed really in the era where a lot of the resistant weeds that had really taken hold. And so as Nufarm was looking at how can we develop a product around some of these key principles, we have a product called Panther Pro. It's a liquid flumioxazin premix that also includes metribuzin and imazethapyr. And so obviously we're using key active ingredients that were mentioned here this morning, particularly the flumioxazin and metribuzin as drivers on mare's tail as well as the amaranthus complex as well. So it's really going to be a valuable tool on a couple of these driver weeds. We also have the imazethapyr in there too, and get into conversations around group 2 herbicides with imazethapyr. I think one of the real values that we've seen in the plot work is, number one, it is bringing good residual on a lot of grass weeds, and in many cases we haven't considered those our biggest problem weeds. We're taking care of them with either glufosinate in a Liberty Link program or just with glyphosate post, but certainly if we can address even the residual control of grasses with the imazethapyr, it's putting less pressure on our post-emerge products to be taking care of the grasses. And certainly we know we could see some shifts in susceptibility or tolerance with some of the annual grasses as well. So again, we're really addressing, number one, the key drivers on broadleaf weeds, as well as having the grass component with the imazethapyr. Then, and final point on Panther Pro is at those rates. As you dig into how the product is built at recommended rates, you do get a full shot of flumioxazin as well as a quarter pound of metribuzin. So it's delivering not only additional burn down with the metribuzin, but then it's got a rate in there that's going to deliver a quarter pound or greater at labeled use rates. That's going to really help out on the residual component, be it on mare's tail or water hemp, Palmer amaranth as well. So again, a couple of products here just out of our portfolio. I think it lines up with some of our guiding principles for resistance management, bringing in effective modes of action, and also allowing a lot of flexibility depending on the trait system that you're running ahead of soybeans, obviously, here. So with that, again, appreciate everybody's attendance today, and I think we've got a few minutes for questions.
Yes, we do. Great. Okay, so Brian, I am going to transfer presenter privileges back to you. If you don't mind showing your contact slide there, so that if we don't get through all the questions today, folks can contact you for follow-up. So that would be great. Perfect. All right, there we go. So with that, folks, let's head to questions. We will try to get through what we can, and we'll see what we can do. We'll probably go a little over time because we do have quite a few questions flowing on in. Okay, Brian, here we go. First one. If you're in a corn-soybean rotation with resistant weed pressure, how advantageous would it be to implement a corn small grain cover crop? You've got basically go corn, small grain cover crop, then soybeans, or is this not economical?
So when using corn and then a small grain cover crop, so not using it for cash crop, I assume, just as a cover crop, such as wheat, between your corn and soybean. That's what I'm hearing.
That's the interpretation I get from how it's worded in the question.
Okay. Well, I think that could be a good supplement. You know, it's going to improve going into your soybean year a little bit more for the mare's tail management in a no-till situation. Is it going to help a lot if you're, let's just say you're planting wheat? And I know that might be in some areas where they don't want to plant rye, like in Kansas, where it's going to be a major limitation. You're not going to plant rye because of problem to your production wheat. They just want to plant wheat as a cover crop in some situations. That is going to help. Is it worth it? I think it can be if that's something that you're dedicated to doing, is having vegetation on there. If you have highly erodible soil, from weed management standpoint, it's going to, it's going to help supplement your herbicides as well. So I think there's a potential benefit. And for the cost of putting that out there, I assume that overall cost is going to be less than $20 per acre. I think there's some advantages to it. So it's something that I would certainly consider.
Okay, great. I'm not sure what slide this is referring to specifically, but I'm hoping you do. This individual says, Brian showed Sharpen and Valor together in a slide for May applications for mare's tail control, but this individual says these two cannot be used together unless the labels have changed, correct?
Correct. And so if that was on a slide, I'm mistaken. I think I might have showed that on a chart showing the different herbicide options, but that didn't mean that all could be mixed together. And so you can combine those if you wait 14 days prior to planting. You cannot do that right at planting, that combination. So there are certain ways you could mix those two, but there are some ways that you cannot combine the two for soybean weed management, and that would be right at planting. So the audience member is correct that you cannot always put those two herbicides together.
Okay, great. Next question. Assuming a field also has ALS-resistant species, is there still value in having chloromuron as part of your herbicide program, tagging along in a premix with sulfentrazone? Hopefully I pronounced everything properly.
Yes, you did. And so that's a great question. It's actually been the subject of one of my graduate students' research for the last several years. So what we observed is there can still be a great value by using our ALS herbicides such as chloromuron in that soil residual premix. And I'm not recommending anybody does this, but in populations, field populations that have been confirmed as ALS resistant, we know that not all the plants in that field are resistant. It just means that somebody might have found one plant that's resistant. In most of the fields in Indiana, we found that majority of fields don't contain that contain ALS resistance. Well, it's not the majority of the plants in that field. So just to give you a frame of reference, we have used chlormuron as a residual herbicide instead of post, and we've had control up to 80% of our water hemp population by using chlormuron in a ALS resistant field where probably only about 40% are ALS resistant. So it is controlling some of those resistant individuals because you're using a high dose of the herbicide in a residual application on the smallest size plant possible, which is a germinating seedling. So it has a lot of value. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not recommending anybody manage water hemp or Palmer amaranth or mare's tail just by using ALS herbicide. Just know that there's value in keeping that in the herbicide strategy overall.
Okay. Last one for you, Brian, as we run out of time here. Does water quality impact herbicide residual control?
Good question. So water quality certainly does impact foliar applied herbicides. I have not seen any research to date that would suggest water quality influences residual herbicide activity. It's because the water quality, hard water cations such as iron, calcium, magnesium can form a complex with the post-emergence herbicides, not allowing for foliar absorption. Herbicides that are so residual don't have to go through foliar absorption, so those complexing agents, hard water cations, wouldn't have the same effect. Again, I haven't seen any data on that, so I don't think there really is an interaction.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for answering those questions, folks. We are running out of time here. I want to thank both Brian, Dan for their time. We thank both of you for your presentations today, and we certainly thank Nufarm for their sponsorship of this webinar. Again, their sponsorship makes it free to you. We hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and we look forward to having you for future webinars offered by the American Society of Agronomy. So with that, thank you all. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Dan, again. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I hope you have a fantastic day, a fantastic week. Take care, and bye-bye.